For my Unessay, I chose to show the concept of what it means to be an American from the perspective of a Greek immigrant in the 1950s. Since I am of 100% Greek heritage, Greek immigration seemed to be a pretty fitting topic for this final project. However, in order to more accurately display perspective on this topic, I decided to use the story of my grandfather's immigration experience from Greece to the United States. As I tell his story, I'll highlight the similarities between his personal experience and the experiences of other Greek immigrants during this time. The beginning of this story takes place in 1924 in the small village of Letokido, Greece. This is the year my grandfather James Koukoulianis was born. As a child, my grandfather, like many other Greeks, grew up in a single-mother household, as his father was legally working in the U.S. and sending money back home to the family. Throughout the 1930s, my great-grandmother made several attempts to obtain U.S. permanent residency for both her and my grandfather. However, she was unsuccessful, as an isolationist policy and multiple immigration acts kept herself and other Eastern Europeans away from their families and out of America. After failing to obtain permanent residency, my grandfather remained in Greece and soon found himself in the midst of World War II. During the war, Nazis invaded his village and displaced him from his home. However, after several years, the war had finally come to an end, or so he thought. Immediately after World War II, the Greek Civil War erupted in 1946, and my grandfather again found himself in the middle of conflict. The Greek Civil War eventually ended in 1949, and the U.S. relaxed its immigration standards with legislation like the Displaced Persons Act. Shortly after these standards relaxed, my grandfather boarded the Queen Frederica and embarked on his journey to America. After a 2-week voyage across the Atlantic, my grandfather's dream of coming to the States finally became a reality in 1951 as he arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey. Once the ship arrived, he was brought to an immigration center and changed his 16-letter last name, Koukoulianis, to Poulos. Although this might seem odd, this was common among many Greek immigrants, as names were often anglicized or shortened upon immigration. After going through immigration protocol, he was taken to Greenwich, Connecticut, where he met his father for the first time at 26 years of age. Upon arriving in Greenwich, my grandfather did what Greek immigrants do. He picked up a spatula and started working at the family diner. At this time, the restaurant business was the first stable economic base for Greeks in America, and the easiest way to reduce labor costs was by using family members for labor. For this reason, most Greeks found themselves, in one way or another, working in the restaurant industry. Although my grandfather had the world's heaviest Greek accent, he was previously educated in British English before he came to America. However, he still needed other ways to assimilate into American society and found that the easiest way to do this was through the Greek church. The church served as a unifying force among many immigrants and was both a cultural and social institution. In fact, my grandfather actually met my grandmother through a church function in 1955 and ended up marrying her 6 months later. 3 years after their marriage, my grandfather finally obtained American citizenship and had his first daughter 5 years later in 1963. That same year, my grandfather moved his new family to Stamford, Connecticut and achieved the American dream of owning a home in the suburbs. It was also during this time that he left his job at the diner and started working at Pitney Bowes. Although he had ambitions of an office job, my grandfather initially started as an assembly worker in the factory. However, after several years, he eventually worked his way up to a manager in the company, and by the time 1968 came around, he had his second and last daughter, who just happens to be my mom. Similarly to other immigrants, my grandfather made sure that both his children and grandchildren embraced their Greek heritage by participating in church, Greek school, and religious holidays. Although I was only 10 years old when he died, I distinctly remember his love for Greek dancing and how excited he'd get when I'd speak to him in basic Greek. However, this adherence of tradition is not unique to our family, as tradition plays a large role in the lives of many Greek Americans today. Lastly, The final part of this project is summarizing what being an American meant to my grandfather and other Greek immigrants during this time. For most Greek immigrants, the first meaning of being an American centered around the concept of economic opportunity. This in particular was why my grandfather came to America, and in the 1950s, the U.S. was by far the world's largest superpower and offered its residents stable employment and societal economic mobility. The second meaning of being an American centered around the concept of political freedom. In Greece, my grandfather had grown up under the totalitarian regime of dictator Ioannis Metaxa, so naturally, he and many others were grateful for American democracy and basic voting rights. The third and final meaning of being an American for Greek immigrants has to do with preserving the culture of their homeland. Although all immigrants eventually assimilate into American society, they are also conscious of where they came from. For them, successfully assimilating to a new land was equally as important as keeping the Greek tradition alive and strong in their households. This concludes the end of the video, and I'd like to thank you for your time and for listening to what I believe being an American meant to Greek immigrants in the 1950s.